10 days after my husband's funeral, my children walked into my kitchen with a plan to sell my home and take control of my accounts. They said it was for my safety, but deep inside, I knew it was about control. I felt a weight pressing on my chest, the same weight I carried when I realized they saw me as a burden, not as their mother. What they did not know was that their father had left me something hidden for 10 years, and once I opened it, everything about our family would change. It was a cold, damp morning in Portland when the service ended and people began filing out of the funeral home. I stayed near the front, still in my seat, watching the last of the guests leave. My son Evan was the first to return from the parking lot, his black coat buttoned all the way up, his jaw tight. My daughter Ria followed, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. They didn't sit beside me. They stood just far enough away to make it clear they were here for business, not comfort. "We have been talking," Evan began, his tone measured, but his eyes locked on mine. "The house is too much for you now." Ria added that she had looked into several senior living communities with good reputations. Her words carried the air of someone doing me a favor, but her glance toward Evan told me they had rehearsed this together. I folded my hands in my lap, letting the silence stretch between us. For decades, I ran a busy community center, managed schedules, programs, and budgets without anyone holding my hand. Yet here, standing in front of my husband's casket, my children spoke as if I had already lost the ability to decide where I lived or how I lived. Arthur Kim, our family's attorney, approached with a small envelope. He leaned in and quietly said he would need to meet with me later in the week about certain items in the estate. His voice was professional, but I caught a flicker of something in his expression, a hint that there was more to discuss than usual. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket without opening it. When the room emptied, I walked to the casket and rested my hand on the edge. My husband's face was peaceful, as if the years of illness had been lifted away. I remembered the man who could fix anything, who had a quiet confidence about him. We had shared a home for over 40 years, and now, with him gone, our children stood ready to dismantle it in the name of practicality. Outside, the sky hung low and grey. The ride home was quiet, just the hum of the heater and the occasional click of the turn signal. Pulling into the driveway, I paused before getting out, looking at the house. It was a large, weathered Victorian near the shore, the kind of place where every window held a memory. I thought about the rooms filled with the scent of Sunday dinners, the front porch, where we watched storms roll in from the ocean. To my children, it was just a burden waiting to be lifted from my shoulders. To me, it was the last piece of a life we had built together. Inside, I hung my coat, leaving the envelope from Arthur on the hall table for the moment. The air felt different, too still. In the kitchen, Evan's voice from earlier replayed in my mind, steady and convincing, as if I should simply hand over the keys. Ria's list of retirement communities, her efficient delivery of each name, as if she were talking to a client instead of her mother. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. Waiting for the water to boil, I stood by the window and looked out at the street. A couple walked past, holding hands, talking softly. I thought of how quickly a family can shift from togetherness to negotiation. The lines had been drawn before I even had time to grieve. The kettle whistled, sharp in the quiet room. I poured the water over a tea bag, watching the steam rise, and let the warmth spread into my hands. I knew there was more in Arthur's envelope, and I knew Evan and Ria would be back soon to press their case. For now, I wanted to sit in my own kitchen, drink my tea, and remember that this was still my home. If you have ever felt the shift from being cared for to being managed, you will understand that moment. It is a quiet change, but it changes everything. That was the first time I realized this was not going to be about what was best for me, but about what was easiest for them. And I was not ready to make it easy. 2 days later, I walked into the coastal Maine bank, the one my husband had used for decades. The air inside was warm and faintly smelled of polished wood and paper. I told the receptionist my name and that Arthur Kim had arranged for me to meet with the branch manager. She nodded and disappeared through a side door. A moment later, a tall man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses appeared. He introduced himself as Lowell Crane, the branch manager, and asked me to follow him. His office was quiet, with a large window looking out over the harbour. I sat in the chair across from his desk, clutching my bag a little tighter than usual. Lowell opened a file folder and slid a document across the desk toward me. He explained that my husband had maintained a separate account here under the name Project Haven. It was not tied to any of our joint accounts and was structured in a way that required a specific process before anyone could access it. He pointed to the balance printed clearly on the page: $19,502,331.47. For a moment, I did not move. I scanned the numbers again, certain I had misread them. Lowell went on to explain that the account had been opened 10 years ago, with an initial deposit of just over $4 million, and had grown steadily through investments in municipal bonds and income funds. My husband had made regular adjustments, always with long-term growth in mind. From another folder, Lowell pulled out an envelope addressed to me in my husband's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. His words were brief, almost businesslike, but I could hear his voice as I read. "If you are reading this, I am gone. I trust you to know what to do with what I have built. This is meant for something good, something lasting." Beneath the letter was a set of authorization forms. Lowell explained that I was the sole beneficiary, but there were clear conditions on how the funds could be moved. Arthur Kim had been listed as the legal advisor for any decisions. Lowell had already spoken to him and said he would be in touch soon with more details. As Lowell spoke, I kept thinking about how my husband had never once mentioned this account. We had lived comfortably, but never extravagantly. This amount of money, hidden away for a decade, meant he had been planning something without me knowing. Lowell reached for another folder and showed me a small stack of documents labeled Project Haven. The first few pages were financial summaries, but underneath were printed blueprints and typed notes. I recognized my husband's neat handwriting in the margins. There were floor plans for a single-story building with wide hallways and private rooms, sketches of a landscaped courtyard, and lists of amenities like an on-site clinic and shared dining spaces. The title on each page read Senior Affordable Housing and Community Health Center. Lowell did not know the full story behind the plans, only that my husband had stored them with the account records. I thanked him, signed the initial acknowledgement forms, and agreed to meet with Arthur later that week. Walking back to my car, the air felt sharper, the gulls louder over the harbour. I sat for a while in the driver's seat, holding the envelope with my husband's letter. The weight of it was more than paper. It was the realization that there was a part of his life he had kept entirely to himself. And now it was in my hands, along with a sum of money that could change far more than just my own circumstances. When I pulled into my driveway, I did not go inside immediately. I stayed in the car, looking at the house, wondering what Evan and Rhea would say if they knew. Based on the way they had spoken to me at the funeral, I could imagine the arguments. They would want to take control, to decide how the money should be used or divided. Inside, I placed the envelope and documents in the top drawer of my desk, locking it before I stepped back. I knew this was only the beginning. Whatever my husband had intended, it was clear he had trusted me to see it through, and I intended to find out exactly what that meant. That evening, I cleared the dining table and laid out the blueprints Lowell had shown me. The paper still carried a faint smell of the bank's storage room, a mix of dust and something metallic. Under the lamplight, the lines and measurements stood out crisp and deliberate. The first set was labelled Community Health Centre. Wide hallways, private exam rooms, a reception area with space for seating that felt generous instead of cramped. There was a small pharmacy marked in one corner and a staff break room with its own kitchenette. In the margins, my husband's handwriting noted natural lighting for patient rooms, soundproofing for privacy, and spaces for counselling sessions. The next set was for senior affordable housing. 2 residential wings connected by a central community hall. Each unit had its own kitchenette, but there were also shared dining areas, reading rooms, and a landscaped courtyard. My husband had drawn small circles in the garden plan, labelling them as benches in the sun. I turned the pages slowly, feeling the weight of each detail. He had not only invested the money, he had invested thought, care, and time into imagining how people would live in these spaces. It was more than a construction project. It was a vision for how to treat people with dignity. I needed to speak to someone who could help me understand the scope of this. The name that came to mind was Dr. May Delgado. We had worked together years ago when she ran outreach programs through the local hospital. May was now the director of Coast Care, a non-profit that focused on community health services in underserved areas. The next morning, I called her office. Her assistant said she was free after lunch, so I gathered the blueprints, tucked my husband's letter in my bag, and drove to the Coast Care building. The winter sky hung low over the harbour as I parked and walked inside. May's office was lined with framed photographs of volunteers at health fairs, mobile clinics, and ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new facilities. She stood when I entered, her expression shifting from polite greeting to genuine surprise. We had not seen each other in over a decade. I spread the blueprints on her desk. She leaned over them, tracing the hallways with her fingertip, reading the notes in the margins. Her brow furrowed, not in doubt, but in concentration. "These are solid designs," she said quietly. "Whoever drew them knew what they were doing." I told her they were my husband's work, part of something he had kept from me for years. She asked a few practical questions about funding and timeline, and I explained what Lowell had told me about the account. May leaned back in her chair, considering. She said projects like this require more than money. They need permits, political will, and a coordinated plan to navigate the slow machinery of local government. She warned me that not everyone would welcome such a development. Some would see it as a threat to their own interests. I asked her if Coast Care would be willing to advise me. She said they could, but it would take commitment and a clear strategy. She offered to bring in an architect she trusted to review the plans for feasibility and to help map out the process from permits to groundbreaking. Before I left, May walked me to the door and said she believed in the value of what I was holding. She had seen too many projects stall because the people behind them underestimated the resistance they would face. Her advice was to move quietly at first, gather allies, and be ready for obstacles that might come from unexpected places. Back at home, I set the blueprints on my desk and looked at them again. The lines and measurements no longer felt like abstract drawings. They felt like a promise. I thought about my husband working on them in private, choosing not to share the burden until he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the plans and thinking about what May had said. The money was there, the vision was clear, but the path forward would be anything but simple. My children would see only the risk. Others might see an opportunity to block it for their own gain. I knew one thing for certain. If my husband had trusted me to carry this forward, I was not going to set it aside. The first step would be to meet with the architect May recommended, and from there, begin building the kind of support that could make Project Haven more than just a set of blueprints in a drawer. 2 evenings after my meeting with May, I heard Evan's truck pull into the driveway. Ria's car was right behind him. I had not invited them, but I knew they would not be here for a casual visit. I opened the front door before they could knock. Their faces carried the same set look they had worn at the funeral, a blend of determination and quiet judgment. They walked past me into the living room without taking off their coats. Evan remained standing, his hands on his hips, scanning the room as if measuring what would be gone once the house was sold. Ria sat down on the sofa, her bag still on her shoulder, and leaned forward. She began speaking in that deliberate tone she used when explaining policies to her clients. She said they had been talking and had agreed it was time to address my finances. Evan stepped in to say they had already contacted a financial advisor who specialized in situations like mine. He spoke as if this was a service I should be grateful for. Ria opened a folder from her bag and slid a printed packet onto the coffee table. It was a list of senior living communities, complete with pricing and amenities. She pointed out a couple of names she said were close enough for them to visit often. I looked at the papers, but did not touch them. I told them I appreciated their concern, but I had no plans to leave my home or hand over my accounts. Ria's expression tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She reminded me that Dad had always handled the big financial decisions and that managing large sums could be overwhelming. Evan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He said that with what had happened recently, it would be safer if they managed things jointly. His voice was calm, but there was an edge under it, like he was trying to keep from sounding impatient. I let a pause settle in before answering. I told them there was a difference between helping someone and taking control from them. I said their father had trusted me enough to leave certain responsibilities in my hands, and that I intended to honor that trust. Evan stood up, pacing a short line across the rug. He said he was not trying to take anything from me, but he needed to be sure I was making the right decisions. Ria added that once money was gone, it was gone, and there would be no way to get it back. I reminded them both that they did not have the full picture of what their father had planned. There were things he had left specifically for me to handle, and I was not prepared to hand them over. My voice stayed steady, but I could feel my pulse quicken. They exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations siblings have without words. Evan stopped pacing. He said they only wanted to protect me from making mistakes. I said I understood their fear, but I was not afraid of making choices. I was more concerned about what would happen if I let someone else make them for me. The room felt smaller as the conversation wound down. Ria gathered the folder and stood. She said they would revisit the topic soon. Evan's parting words were that they hoped I would think about it carefully. I told them I already had. After they left, I stayed in the living room for a long time, listening to the sound of their cars fade down the street. The packet of senior living options sat untouched on the coffee table. I did not need to open it to know it was not my future. Later, in my study, I unlocked the desk drawer and took out the blueprints. I ran my hand over the edges of the paper, feeling the faint texture under my fingertips. In my husband's handwriting, next to the title block, were the words, "For when it matters most." I knew exactly what he meant. The conversation with Evan and Ria had confirmed what I suspected since the funeral. They saw my situation as something to be managed, not respected. That made my next steps even clearer. I was going to move forward with the plans, and I was going to do it without asking their permission. Arthur called me the next afternoon and asked if I could come by his office. His voice had that measured tone he used when there was something important, but not urgent enough to cause alarm. I drove into town and found him waiting with a folder open on his desk. He slid a document toward me, the heading in bold type. It was an addendum to the account my husband had left. Arthur tapped the second page, where a single paragraph was highlighted. If the project tied to the account funds was not under active construction within 18 months of my husband's death, the entire balance would transfer to an international foundation. The clause was clear and absolute. There were no extensions, no exceptions. Arthur explained that the clause had been part of the account agreement from the beginning, signed by my husband over 10 years ago. It meant he had been planning this as a timed obligation, not just a loose intention. I sat back, letting the weight of it sink in. 18 months was both generous and impossibly short when it came to permits, contractors, and all the moving parts of a project this size. Arthur walked me through what would have to happen first. A legal entity needed to be established to receive the funds, contracts had to be drawn up, permits secured, and the first phase of construction started before the deadline. Every step would require coordination, approvals, and people I could trust. He told me bluntly that it would be a race against the clock. I left his office with the document in my bag, the words circling in my mind. At home, I called May and told her what Arthur had shown me. She was silent for a moment, then said, "It changed everything." A project of this scale already had natural delays built in. Now there was a deadline hanging over every decision. She said we needed to begin mapping the entire process immediately. The next morning, I met May at her office. She had already cleared her afternoon. We spread the blueprints across her conference table and began listing each step we would need to complete, from land acquisition to breaking ground. She spoke about the layers of approval at the town level, the state inspections, and the inevitable pushback from those who preferred the land remain available for private development. May called in a colleague from her planning team, a woman named Tricia, who specialized in navigating municipal permits. Tricia explained that the first hurdle would be securing the right piece of property. Without that, we could not apply for half of the necessary approvals. She suggested starting conversations with property owners quietly, to avoid sparking interest from developers who might move faster just to block us. We spent hours going over timelines and dependencies, the things that had to happen before other things could start. Every time we thought we had a sequence worked out, we would find another step that added days or weeks. By the time I left, we had a rough calendar pinned to the wall, colored lines showing parallel tasks and deadlines marked in red. The end date was unmistakable. That night, I walked along the shore near my house, the wind sharp off the water. I thought about how my husband must have felt when he signed that clause. He had known it would force someone's hand. Maybe he thought a deadline was the only way to ensure the project would actually happen. Maybe he knew I would not let it slip away once the clock started ticking. When I got home, I took the document out again and read it slowly. The language was legal and impersonal, but I could almost hear his voice underneath it, telling me this mattered enough to protect it from being stalled or ignored. I folded it carefully and put it back in the folder. The next morning, May called with a suggestion for the first property to investigate. It was an old marina site a few miles from the town centre, close to public transportation, and with enough land for both the housing and the health centre. The current owner had been trying to sell for years without success. May thought it could be ideal, but she warned that once word got out, the competition would grow fierce. I agreed to see it that week. There was no time to waste. The clock had already started, and every day that passed was another day gone from the 18 months I had been given. May and I drove out to see the old marina site 2 days later. The sky was clear, but the air was cold, the kind of chill that settles deep and stays there. The property sat at the end of a narrow road, lined with weathered boathouses and small cottages. Beyond a rusting chain-link fence, the land opened up to a wide stretch of gravel and cracked pavement, bordered on one side by the harbour and on the other by a stand of wind-bent pines. It was easy to see what May meant. The marina buildings were long gone, leaving a clean slate. The harbour view was open, and the bus stop was only a block away. There was enough space here for both the housing and the health centre, with room left for gardens or walking paths. I could imagine the courtyard from my husband's drawings fitting perfectly into this space. May had arranged for the owner to meet us. He was a tall, thin man named Harold, wearing a faded cap and heavy gloves. He explained that he had been trying to sell for over 3 years. Developers had shown interest, but backed out when they realized how much work the site would require before it could be built on. Harold was willing to sell for less than his original price if the deal could move quickly. I walked the length of the property with him, noting the slight slope toward the water and the way the light hit in the afternoon. Harold spoke with a mix of pride and resignation, as if he was ready to let go, but wanted it to go to someone who would do something worthwhile. May asked a few practical questions about zoning and past environmental assessments. Harold had kept the reports and said he would send copies to her office. When we left, May was already thinking aloud about the permit process. The property was zoned for mixed use, which meant we could combine residential and healthcare facilities, but any changes to the footprint would trigger a full site review. That could open the door for delays if someone wanted to slow us down. 2 days later, May called to tell me she had received the environmental reports. The site had a clean record, except for some minor soil contamination from the old fuel tanks, which had been removed years ago. It was nothing unusual for a property this close to the water, but it would require an additional inspection before permits could be issued. That was when she mentioned a name I had not heard before. Pierce Holliday, a member of the town council who chaired the planning and zoning committee. May said Holliday was known for his close ties to a developer named Nolan Brixford, whose company had been trying to buy waterfront properties for high-end projects. If Holliday decided our project was not in his interest, he could find ways to delay the approvals. May's warning stayed with me. I began reading about Holliday in the local paper, noting how often his name appeared alongside stories about new luxury developments. Brixford's name appeared too, usually in the business section with articles about record sales and ambitious expansions. The following week, May's office received an official request for additional documentation on the marina site. The request was signed by Holliday himself. It included a list of items far beyond the standard requirements, some of which had already been addressed in Harold's reports. Tricia, from May's team, recognized the tactic immediately. It was a way to stall the process without outright denying the application. May suggested we meet with Holliday directly to present the project and gauge his reaction. She arranged a time during open office hours at the town hall. Holliday greeted us with a practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. He glanced at the blueprints, but spent more time asking vague questions about long-term financing and operational costs. His tone was polite, but I could sense the disinterest under the surface. When we left, May said she was certain Holliday had no intention of helping us move quickly. The challenge would be to get enough public support that stalling the project would be unpopular. She also reminded me that once the purchase agreement for the marina was signed, we could at least file the first round of permit applications and start the clock on their deadlines. I called Harold that afternoon and told him I wanted to proceed with the purchase. We agreed on a price that left enough of the budget intact for early site work and design adjustments. He sounded relieved and said he would have the papers ready by the end of the week. As I hung up, I felt the first real step had been taken. The land was not just a possibility anymore. It was going to be ours, and with it came the start of everything my husband had imagined. The road ahead was already uneven, but standing still was no longer an option. The purchase agreement for the marina site was signed on a Thursday morning. By the afternoon, May and Tricia were already working on the first round of permit applications. I watched them spread forms across May's conference table, each sheet representing another step toward breaking ground. Tricia moved with precision, ticking off requirements, cross-referencing Harold's reports, and adding new surveys where gaps appeared. While they worked, my phone rang. It was Evan. His tone was lighter than usual, but there was an undercurrent I recognized. He asked if I was free for dinner. I told him I was busy, and he said they would come by the house instead. He used the word we, which meant Ria would be there too. They arrived just after sunset, bringing the cold air in with them. Evan stayed standing, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, while Ria settled into the chair across from me. She started by saying they had been talking a lot about my situation. Evan added that they had both spoken to a lawyer about the possibility of arranging shared financial oversight. The way he said it, that made it sound like an act of generosity, not an intrusion. I told them calmly that my finances were not up for negotiation. Ria leaned forward, her voice softer, but her words sharper. She said they worried I might be influenced by people who did not have my best interests at heart. Evan nodded, mentioning that big projects attract the wrong kind of attention. I realized then that they knew I was moving forward with something, even if they did not know the details. I told them there was nothing to worry about, and that I was capable of managing the responsibilities I had. The room went quiet for a few seconds before Ria spoke again. She said they might have to take steps to protect me if I refused to involve them. When they left, the air in the house felt heavier. I walked into my study and locked the door behind me. On the desk, the blueprints were still laid out, anchored by a stack of folders. I traced the outline of the main building with my finger, grounding myself in the reason I was doing this. My husband had trusted me with more than money. He had trusted me to defend his vision. The next morning, May called with news. Holiday's office had sent another request for supplemental documents, most of which were already included in the original submission. Tricia suspected it was another attempt to delay. May said we needed to file a formal response within the week, accompanied by a legal notice of compliance to prevent further redundant requests. Arthur came to May's office that afternoon. He read through the correspondence from Holiday's committee, his brow tightening as he moved from one page to the next. He said the requests were excessive, and that, in his experience, this was a clear tactic to slow progress. He recommended creating a separate legal entity to handle the funds and the project management, making it harder for anyone to challenge my authority. By the end of the meeting, we had a plan. The Markham Haven Trust would be established, with a non-profit arm to operate the centre once it was built. The trust structure would make the finances transparent and insulated, a direct counter to any claim that I was acting recklessly. Arthur would oversee the legal filings, May would coordinate the operational framework, and Tricia would continue to push the permits forward. I signed the paperwork that evening. The act of putting my name on those documents felt like crossing a threshold. There was no way to turn back without abandoning everything. That weekend, May arranged for me to meet a retired project manager named Leon, who had overseen several large community builds. We met in a small cafe near the harbour. Leon was direct, explaining the importance of sequencing tasks so that delays in one area would not stall the entire project. He warned that political resistance often grew strongest in the middle stages, when opponents realized the work might actually succeed. I listened carefully, taking notes. Leon offered to review our schedule and point out potential bottlenecks. He also knew contractors who might be willing to commit early if they believed in the project's purpose. When I left the cafe, The wind off the water was sharp against my face, but I felt steadier than I had in weeks. The trust was in motion, the land was ours, and the team around me was growing. There were people who wanted to see this built, and I was determined to keep moving, no matter how many obstacles appeared in our path. May suggested we hold a community listening session before the next planning committee meeting. She said it would help us gather visible support and make it harder for Holiday to quietly stall the project. We booked the fellowship hall at a church near the marina site, a space large enough for a crowd but still informal. In the days leading up to it, May and her team printed flyers and reached out to neighborhood groups, local health advocates, and senior organizations. Dana Whitlock, the reporter May trusted, agreed to cover the event. Her interest was genuine, but she also knew a strong turnout could make for a compelling story. On the night of the meeting, the hall smelled faintly of coffee and the wood polish on the pews. Chairs were set up in rows, a long table in the front for the project team, and a portable screen for the presentation. I arrived early, carrying a folder with my husband's blueprints and the summary sheets Tricia had prepared. By the time the meeting started, the room was nearly full. May welcomed everyone and introduced the idea behind the project: affordable senior housing integrated with a community health center. She explained the benefits, not just for the residents, but for the surrounding neighborhoods. Tricia spoke about the site selection, the clean environmental record, and the plans to address the minor soil remediation. When it was my turn, I stood and told the room about my husband's vision, how he had drawn the plans years ago and set aside the funds to make it real. I kept my words simple, letting the story carry itself. I could see heads nodding as I described his belief in creating spaces that offered safety, dignity, and connection. Dana moved quietly through the room, taking photographs and jotting notes. Her camera focused on the blueprints spread out on the table, on the volunteers leaning in to look closer, on the small group of seniors from the neighborhood asking about application timelines. After the formal part of the meeting, people clustered in small groups. Some came to the front to speak with me, others with May and Tricia. A retired nurse offered to volunteer at the health center once it opened. A local carpenter said he knew tradespeople who might be willing to donate labor for part of the build. Their offers were genuine, and each one felt like another brick laid in the foundation we were building. The next morning, Dana's article appeared online. It featured a photo of the marina site bathed in late afternoon light, and another of me holding the blueprints. The headline framed the project as a community effort already gaining momentum. By noon, the article had been shared dozens of times on local social media pages. 2 days later, an anonymous post appeared on a neighborhood forum, claiming the project was unrealistic and hinting that the funds might be mismanaged. It offered no evidence, only speculation. May forwarded it to me, her message short. This is how they start. She suspected the post was meant to seed doubt before the planning committee met again. That evening, as I locked the front door, I noticed a plain envelope on the mat. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message telling me to drop the project before I made a costly mistake. There was no signature, no return address. I set it down on the kitchen counter, looking at it for a long time before sliding it into a drawer. May and Arthur both agreed the letter was an intimidation tactic. Arthur advised not to respond directly, but to keep it as a record. May said the best answer would be to keep moving forward in the open, with nothing to hide. We decided to compile all the community support we had gathered so far into a formal report. Tricia collected the volunteer offers, letters from local organizations, and the sign-in sheets from the meeting. Arthur prepared a legal brief summarizing the trust structure, the funding safeguards, and the timeline tied to the 18-month clause. By the end of the week, We had a binder thick with documents ready to present to the planning committee. Every page was another layer of protection, a way to show that this project was not a vague idea, but a well-structured plan backed by people who believed in it. The opposition had started to make itself known, but so had our supporters. The difference now was that our supporters were visible, and they were ready to speak up when it counted. The next committee meeting would show just how much weight that could carry. The agenda for the next planning committee meeting listed our project as the final item. May said that was deliberate. Putting us at the end meant less time for discussion and fewer people in the audience. It also made it easier to push the decision to another meeting. We arrived early, carrying the binder of supporting documents, a set of mounted blueprints, and copies of the site plans. The meeting room was small, with rows of folding chairs facing a long table where the committee members sat. Pierce Holliday occupied the center seat, flipping through a folder without looking at us. As the other agenda items dragged on, I noticed May checking the clock. By the time Holliday called our project forward, only a handful of community members remained in the audience. Dana was still there, her camera resting in her lap, and a few of the volunteers from the church meeting had stayed to show support. May began the presentation, her tone steady and measured. She outlined the purpose of the development, the benefits to the town, and the detailed timeline tied to the funding. Tricia followed with a summary of the environmental reports and the remediation plan. Then I spoke briefly about my husband's vision and the trust he had placed in me to carry it forward. When we finished, Holliday leaned back in his chair. He said the committee had received concerns about the feasibility of the project and the long-term sustainability of its operations. His words were vague, but the implication was clear. He was giving weight to the anonymous doubts that had been circulating. May asked to address those concerns directly. She referenced the legal brief Arthur had prepared, pointing to the safeguards built into the trust and the operational plan. She also presented letters from local organizations pledging ongoing support. Holliday listened, then shuffled the papers without comment. A motion was made by one of the other members to table the project for further review. Before it could be seconded, Dana stood up from the audience. She stated her name and affiliation with the local paper, then said she had attended the community meeting where dozens of residents voiced support for the project. Her voice was calm, but it carried across the room. She asked the committee to consider that their constituents were watching. The motion to table was withdrawn, but Holliday called for a recess. During the break, May told me this was the moment to hold them to the rules. Arthur had quietly entered the room and was standing near the back. When the committee reconvened, Arthur requested to address them as legal counsel for the project. He cited the town's own procedural guidelines, which required that applications meeting all documented criteria be moved forward for review rather than delayed without cause. He reminded them that the deadlines for responses were enforceable under state law. If the committee failed to act within the prescribed time frame, the application could be deemed approved by default. The room shifted. Holliday's expression hardened, but he knew Arthur was correct. After a brief exchange among the members, a vote was called to advance the project to the next stage of review. It passed, though without enthusiasm from Holliday. As we packed up, Dana caught my eye and gave a small nod. The volunteers who had stayed came forward to shake my hand, their quiet encouragement cutting through the tension of the evening. May whispered that this was only the first hurdle, but it was an important one. Outside, the air was cold and the parking lot nearly empty. We walked to our cars in silence, each of us holding on to the knowledge that the project had survived another attempt to slow it down. The next steps would be just as difficult, but we had proven we could stand our ground in the room where decisions were made. When I got home, I placed the binder of documents back on my desk and set the blueprints beside it. The lines and measurements looked the same as they had weeks ago, but now they carried the weight of a small but significant victory. The clock on the 18 months was still running, but for the first time, I felt we had moved it forward in our favor. The following week began quietly enough, but it did not last. Early Monday morning, Arthur called to tell me that a petition had been filed in probate court by Evan and Rhea. They were seeking a form of limited guardianship over my financial affairs, citing concerns about my ability to manage what they called an unusually large and complex estate. Arthur's tone was steady, but the weight of his words settled heavily in the room around me. By mid-afternoon, he had a copy of the filing in hand. The petition listed examples they claimed demonstrated poor judgment. None of it was true, but it was clear they were prepared to use the scale of the project as evidence against me. Arthur said the first hearing would be held within 2 weeks, and that we needed to prepare a full account of the trust structure, the safeguards, and every step taken so far. May and I met the next morning at her office. She listened as I explained what my children had done, her expression tightening. Then she began listing everything we could present to counter the petition. Tricia joined us, bringing the complete record of the application process, the correspondence with the planning committee, and the volunteer commitments we had documented. Arthur came later that day with his own stack of papers. He explained that in court, perception would matter as much as fact. We would need to demonstrate that the project was not a reckless personal endeavor, but a structured initiative with professional oversight. He suggested that both May and Leon, the retired project manager, be prepared to testify about the operational plan and the feasibility of meeting the deadlines tied to the funding. The days that followed were consumed with preparation. I spent hours in my study reviewing timelines, budgets, and correspondence, making sure every detail was clear in my mind. The more I looked through the records, the more I understood how my husband had built this to be both possible and defensible, if only the person holding it would not give in. When the hearing day arrived, I walked into the courthouse with Arthur beside me. Evan and Rhea were already seated at the front with their attorney. They did not look at me as I took my place at the opposite table. The judge entered, and the clerk read the petition into the record. Their attorney began by painting a picture of a vulnerable widow being persuaded into a risky, large-scale construction project. He referred repeatedly to my age and to the size of the estate, implying that I could not possibly grasp the scope of what I was attempting. Arthur responded by calmly walking through the trust's formation, the escrow accounts, and the oversight by licensed professionals. May testified about the operational structure, emphasizing the community partnerships and the safeguards in place. Leon explained the construction timeline, his voice steady as he described how each phase was planned to avoid delays. When it was my turn, I spoke simply. I told the court that my husband had trusted me to carry out his vision and had left me with the resources and the plan to do so. I explained that I had surrounded myself with people whose expertise filled the gaps in my own knowledge, and that every step taken so far had been deliberate and documented. The judge listened without interruption, taking notes. After both sides had presented their cases, he said he would rule from the bench. His decision was clear. The petition for guardianship was denied. He found no evidence that I lacked the capacity to manage my affairs, and noted that the project appeared to be responsibly structured and competently advised. Evan and Rhea gathered their papers without speaking to me. I watched them leave the courtroom, their faces unreadable. Arthur turned to me and said quietly that this had been an important victory, not just for the project, but for my authority over it. That evening, back at home, I placed the court's written order in the same folder that held my husband's letter and the 18-month clause. It was one more piece of protection, another layer between the project and those who might try to take it from me. The next morning, May called to say that with the hearing behind us, we could return our focus entirely to the permits and the early site work. The challenges ahead were still significant, but the foundation we had built was holding. The trust was intact, the land was ours, and for the moment, there was nothing standing between us and the next stage of bringing the plans to life. Spring arrived with a stubborn chill that seemed to slow the thaw, but on the construction site, the pace only quickened. The legal battle behind us, crews moved with a quiet urgency, pouring foundations, setting steel, and framing the first outlines of what would become the community centre. I visited daily, often walking the perimeter with Leon, while he explained the work completed and what lay ahead. Arthur stopped by one afternoon, not in his suit, but in a windbreaker, hands in his pockets as he surveyed the site. He said that keeping visible in the community was just as important as the work itself. People were beginning to see that the project was real, not just a plan on paper. That visibility would protect us almost as much as the trust's legal structure. Still, I could feel undercurrents. At the grocery store, a friend mentioned she had heard Evan was telling people the project was a financial trap I would regret. At the post office, another acquaintance said she had seen Ria at a luncheon, surrounded by women who seemed to hang on her every word. It was clear they were still trying to shape a narrative in town. May called one evening to say she had caught wind of an anonymous letter sent to the local paper, questioning whether the trust funds were truly secure. She had already spoken to the editor, who promised not to run anything without verification, but the incident underscored how persistent these attacks could be. I thanked her, and then sat for a long while in the quiet of my living room, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Instead of anger, I felt something steadier. The hearing had taught me that the only way forward was to keep moving, to build in plain sight, and to let progress speak louder than rumors. That resolve carried me through the next weeks as crews raised the frame of the main hall, each beam locking into place like another piece of proof that we were advancing. One crisp morning, the first trusses went up. I stood with a small group of volunteers who had come to watch, their breath forming clouds in the air. The sun caught the metal as it lifted, and for a moment, the shape of the building became clear. It was no longer just an idea or a defense against my children's ambitions. It was becoming something tangible, something that would outlast the bitterness that had surrounded its beginnings. Tricia suggested we begin inviting community members for brief site tours. At first, I hesitated, worried it might draw more scrutiny, but she argued that showing the work would build trust among the very people who would one day use the centre. We arranged the first tour for a Saturday, and to my surprise, nearly 24 people came. They walked the gravel paths with me, listened as Leon explained the layout, and nodded as May outlined the programs we planned to host. After they left, Leon remarked that the energy on site had shifted. The workers seemed more purposeful, the volunteers more engaged. I realized he was right. The project was no longer mine alone to defend. It was starting to belong to the town. By mid-May, the roof was on, and the walls were being enclosed. I spent more time in meetings about programming, storage needs, and accessibility features. Each choice mattered, and I could feel the weight of responsibility in every decision. But unlike the weight I had carried after my husband's death, this was one I welcomed. Arthur came to see me late in the month with a smile I had learned to read as rare. He handed me a folder containing a letter from the grant committee. They had reviewed our progress and were releasing the next installment of funds ahead of schedule, citing exemplary adherence to the timeline and budget. It was a quiet but unmistakable vote of confidence. That night, I walked through the nearly enclosed structure alone, the scent of fresh wood and insulation still sharp in the air. In the dim light from a single work lamp, I traced my hand along the wall studs, imagining the laughter, the music, and the voices that would one day fill the space. The building was still silent, but it felt alive in a way I had not expected. The next phase would bring new challenges, but for the first time in a long while, I felt that the ground beneath my feet was steady. The center was rising, and so was I. By the first week of summer, the community center was finished. The last coat of paint had dried, the furniture was placed, and the smell of fresh wood lingered in the air. On opening day, the lawn outside filled with neighbors, families, and volunteers who had been part of the journey. I stood off to the side at first, watching them explore the building, their voices bouncing in the high-ceilinged hall. Arthur found me and nodded toward the crowd. He said this was the moment all the paperwork, all the court hearings, and all the whispered rumors had led to. For the first time in years, I felt no trace of the fear that had shadowed me. Inside, May was giving a tour to a group of women from the senior outreach program. They moved slowly through the rooms, touching the walls, commenting on the light and the view from the windows. When I joined them, one of the women told me she had never had a place like this to go. Her voice caught, and I realized that in defending my husband's hidden legacy, I had also created something bigger than my own story. Later in the day, I gave a short speech in the main hall. I spoke about the importance of building something that could not be taken away, not because of contracts or bank accounts, but because it lived in the people who would use it. I thanked the volunteers, the donors, and the friends who had stood by me when it would have been easier to walk away. Evan and Ria did not come. I had not expected them to. Their absence no longer carried the sting it once did. I had made peace with the fact that not every wound would heal, and not every relationship could be repaired. As the sun set, I walked outside to see children running across the grass, the sound of music drifting from inside, and the glow of warm light in every window. I thought about the locked attic, the dusty bank statements, and the years of quiet doubt. All of it had led to this place, this moment. I knew the road ahead would still have its share of obstacles, but the center stood as proof that I could protect what mattered. It was more than a building. It was a statement that I had the right to decide the shape of my own life. When the last guests left, I lingered in the doorway, taking one last look at the hall before turning off the lights. For the first time in a long while, I felt not just relief, but a quiet pride. I had kept my dignity, and in doing so, I had built something no one could take from me. This story is not just about money or buildings. It is about finding the courage to protect what you value, even when those closest to you try to take it away. I believe there is a moment in everyone's life when they have to stand their ground, not for revenge, but for self-respect. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity? If this story made you think of that moment, share your thoughts so we can remind each other of the strength we all carry inside.